Well, I see the participant number has somewhat plateaued, so perhaps we'll start now and allow additional people the time to join us as we do our brief introduction here before we allow our esteemed guests to lead the webinar. So good morning, afternoon, and evening to everyone joining us from their respective time zones. My name is Bill Pickering, and I serve as the co-chair for the IADC Young Professionals Committee in the programming capacity, along with my colleague, friend, and today's webinar moderator, Liana Carnes. Today, we're also joined behind the scene by two of our IADC staff members, Leslie Winters and Angie Gundon, who do all the hands-on work creating events for our membership like today's. So thank you very much to all three of you for putting in the effort for today's webinar. Beyond facilitating our discussion, I'd like to extend our special thanks to our esteemed guests today, who will be sharing their insights from their respective, diverse, and successful careers on both sides of the negotiation table. From Transocean, we are excited to have Stacey Early, Director of Marketing and Contracts, who will be sharing the floor with Precision Drilling's Isabella Loback, Director of Strategic Procurement, as well as S&OP Solutions. So thank you both so much for offering your time and expertise to speak to our membership. Before we begin, I'd like to touch upon a few quick housekeeping items. Attendees' mics have been muted and their cameras will be off. However, we encourage you to ask questions in the Q&A box at your leisure. Liana will lead the discussion, read, and acknowledge questions from the Q&A box as they are sent. Please note, today's session is being recorded as well. We know everyone has a schedule to maintain, so we will endeavor to control our time which may not permit for everyone's questions to be answered. Lastly, at the end of the webinar, a short survey will pop up, and we would certainly appreciate your feedback as we continue to improve our webinar delivery format. So once again, thank you to all our participants. And with that, I'd like to pass things off to Liana.
Thanks, Bill, for a great introduction. Hello, everyone. My name is Liana Carnes. I am the co-chair of development for the Young Professionals Committee. I'm going to read some short bios, and then we'll go into the questions of the webinar. So Stacey Early is the Director of Global Marketing Contracts and Technical Proposals for Transocean, the world's largest deep-water drilling contractor. Prior to joining Transocean 17 years ago, she was with ExxonMobil for 17 years, where she served in global rig coordination, corporate planning, and drilling engineering. In addition, she was with Pennzoil for 4 years as a drilling engineer and offshore rig supervisor. Stacey has a Bachelor of Science in Petroleum Engineering from Texas A&M University and an MBA from Tulane University in New Orleans. She served 6 years as chair of the International Association of Drilling Contractors Contracts Committee and is a member of the Society of Petroleum Engineers, where she served for 4 years on the SPE and Diversity and Inclusion Committee. So thank you, Stacey, for being here. Isabella Loback has over 15 years of supply chain leadership experience in the oil and gas industry. She's worked for Halliburton, SLB, and Frank's International in Brazil and was transferred to the U.S. in 2015 for a global supply chain role. She's been working for Precision Drilling since 2021 as the Director of Strategic Procurement and S&OP, overseeing global procurement, vendor negotiations, contract pricing, and demand planning. So thank you, Isabella, for also being here today. What great industry leaders we have for our topic on negotiations. So do you guys have any opening remarks?
I have to say thank you for having us. This is a fun opportunity after many years of negotiating both formally and informally to get to share some of our, experiences. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Liana, for the introduction. And thanks to the IADC Young Professionals Committee for inviting me and Stacey. It's a pleasure, and we are very excited for it.
Oh, great. So we'll jump right into it. So when talking about negotiations, we can talk about whether it's developmental with new roles or new positions, or we're thinking about changing careers and jobs. And we can talk about a business case, whether it's with vendors or customers or trying to sign a contract. So in these two aspects, when is negotiating appropriate?
Well, I've thought about this question a little bit to think, what does it mean even to negotiate? And looked it up. It's to obtain an outcome by discussion. So if you think about it in that simplistic of a term, kind of a global term, you realize you do it all the time. So you don't have to be negotiating for a car, or in my case, negotiating to place a rig. You can negotiate for just about anything every day. So anytime that you engage with others where there's a decision to be made, that's negotiating. Negotiating is a positive thing. And it means that you are willing to discuss with someone else how an outcome might end and what the results might be. So anytime negotiating is appropriate.
Yeah, I do agree with Stacy. Again, negotiation is a discussion, is a dialogue between two or more parties that you intend to resolve an issue, right? And that both parties will accept and will agree. So anytime you have an issue, you need to negotiate. So it will be always appropriate. And when you talk about business negotiation, I believe it will be always appropriate as business professional. I'm pretty sure it's almost guaranteed that you will need to participate in negotiations, regardless of your job title or your industry. And chances are that you are already participating in negotiations more often than you really realize. For me and Stacy, as an example, negotiation is our function, it's part of what we do. I negotiate with vendors every single day. She negotiates with customers. When it relates to career development, you can negotiate a job offer, you can ask for a salary raise, and it will depend on the situation you are in, right? You need to think about when and how to negotiate. A salary increase, as an example, it can make a huge difference for you on your earnings over your career, right? So doing it and negotiating when you are in a hiring process, you can almost never go wrong. So it's really always appropriate to negotiate.
Awesome. That's great. Yeah, I definitely use it in my personal life a little more than I realize as well. So how would you even start a negotiation? How does that process come about?
I think you need to start with the planning. Planning ahead, have a clear idea of what you hope to achieve or where your boundaries lie. It would be essential for you to any negotiation. So don't go unprepared. We'll talk a lot about it. Without adequate preparation, you can overlook important terms of your deal. So don't, and you cannot think about alternative solutions. So I think to start a negotiation, you need to plan. You need to plan ahead. What are you going to talk? What will be your talking points? And again, we will give more details about that, but I would start with the planning.
Absolutely. My 3 things that I noted here: do your homework, know your counterparties, set your objectives. And that's before you ever get to the negotiation. So when you say, how do you start before you get there. And you start by understanding the situation that you're going into. Negotiating for a car is one of the common things people are familiar with. So if you negotiate for a car, do you not know what kind of car you want before you go? Usually you're not just window shopping. You've maybe done that already. What do you know about it? Well, this type of car typically goes for $30,000. If you get there and they say 35, well, maybe I don't need to work with this guy. Maybe I need to go over to this other guy and talk to them. You've done your homework. You know about the car. You know what kind you want. You know what the prices are. And maybe you know a little bit about the different dealerships or sellers, or maybe used, maybe new. You've done all of that assessment ahead of time. So there's nothing more important than doing your homework ahead of time. But if you're talking about, I'm in the negotiation now, I've walked in the door, what's the first thing I want to do? Do you sit down and start saying, yeah, I want so much for my rig today? No, of course not. These are human beings across the table from you. You start with a conversation and you ask them, hey, Texans or Cowboys? Or something like that. Maybe you ask them, hey, I heard you guys just picked up 3 rigs over here in this other country. That will help. What I kind of call that is fishing. You're going in to talk to people. You want to build a rapport. You also want to find out some things about what's important to them. And you never know what you're going to learn just by having these friendly conversations, or how you might have something in common with that person. There's nothing more important than going into a negotiation knowing something about your counterparties and being able to build that rapport before you start talking about the technical things. So I urge you, if you're actually talking about, I'm walking in the room right now, how do I start the conversation? You start the negotiation with conversation, with chatting and just saying hello.
Perfect. Thank you. I guess with going into that, when you were talking about it, starts with a conversation. Kind of leads into our next question on what are your top 3 negotiation tactics? So clearly one is starting a conversation, but I've heard some people say, oh, I wear certain colors in the room to feel the mood, or what are your top 3 negotiation tactics?
I do agree with Stacy. I have here as my top 3 tactics. Number 1, again, we don't want to keep repeating, but I do believe is the most important is the preparation. Like she said, do your homework. You need to know who you are talking with. So that would be my number 1 as well. My number 2 will be listen more than you talk. I am very surprised how people just don't stop talking, right? So I see us negotiators as detectives, right? You need to be able to do open-ended questions, and then you shut up and listen, right? So I always try to tell my team that the first time of the meeting, after you kind of go more personally, you talk about your life, you need to listen. Use the 70-30 rule, where you listen 70%, where you listen 70% and you talk 30%, and kind of, again, encourage the other negotiator to talk. That's where you kind of start getting all the information you will need kind of drive your thought process and drive your negotiations during the process. And the third one for me, which I think it's a challenge, even for me nowadays, is don't rush. Don't rush. Negotiations may take time, especially when you want them to go smoothly, right? But take time to establish a real relationship with the other party. Don't be afraid to build in pauses. Sometimes we just want to rush, and then that's when things can fail. So it doesn't need to happen all at once, right? If you rush, that's kind of what I'm thinking is you may like to make a mistake, and the other person will notice that you are rushing, and that can be an advantage for the other person. So take your time, don't rush, you'll get there.
Yeah, exactly. You're so right about that. Mine were ASK to GET. If you don't ask for what you want, you won't get it. Or you'll get it by accident, maybe. So if you have certain things that are your objectives, you need to state what they are. You need to be transparent. You need to share, these are my must-haves, and these things are no-goes, and these things, you may not say it this way, but you have to be able to identify what are your walk-away positions. What are the positions that are absolutely critical to success? And sometimes you can use that discussion to build for a future opportunity. Maybe not the one right now, but if you don't ASK, you don't GET. So that is an axiom that actually works in everyday life. The other is you have to give to get. So when you're in a negotiation, you need to be aware of some of the things that you can give up on. They may be your objectives, but your objectives need to be prioritized. So you need to know, here's the big things that I can't let go of. Here's the things that I'd like to get. The rest of this stuff is, I'll ask, but if I don't get it, I can give. Why is that important? Because it's a two-party, every negotiation is two parties, right? It's two sides of this thing. If the other side feels like you're stonewalling them on everything, that you're really not trying to reach a true mutual agreement, then you're not going to get anywhere with the big or the little things. So there has to be give to get. And the other is the same one that Isabella mentioned, the power of silence. I used to have a coworker who was fairly new to rigs, didn't know a lot about them. So she had the good sense in a negotiation, if someone said something that she didn't know much about, to be quiet. She obtained a reputation as a steely negotiator because she would sit there and be quiet until they got so nervous that they'd start talking. And once they start talking, things were coming out that were useful and that she could use to help get to the solution. It was absolutely brilliant when I realized she turned herself into a powerful negotiator, even though she was fairly new to the field, through the power of silence. So don't underestimate the power of silence.
Wow, it's such a cool story. I mean, I feel like sometimes you get in those situations, you're like, okay, somebody has to break the ice. So we do have an audience question. You're saying, taking a point more close to the oil and gas industry, for example, a service provider has a unique type of solution or product which no one else provides in the market. How do you negotiate in this case? All I see being done is a practical sense is volume or price type negotiation. Could you please advise on other strategies?
Sure. I work a lot with innovation. I know, Isabella, you have too through your SLB experiences. There are product lines that maybe a company has that nobody else has exactly like it. Nevertheless, you still have to sell the concept of that unique service, because if you're unable to do that, you're going to have people saying, well, you can't charge whatever you want because at a certain point, this other tool is sufficiently efficient or sufficiently data gathering or whatever the function is that you're negotiating. So you have to be aware of what the other alternatives are and sell that value. I mean, sell the value of that efficiency, that time gain, that data quality gain. And you have to also know who the customer is and do they value that.
Exactly. I totally agree. I think the most important thing there is, like you said, look for alternatives, right? You need to be creative. You need to make sure that if you already went through all your options, you need to look for, okay, what is my common ground with them, right? What do I think I can do different? We talk a lot about data, doing our homework. That's where you get those informations, right? You analyze what they need. When you sit down for a negotiation, you need to have all this in front of you. You need to have your first plan. What are your zone of agreement? But you also need to have all your alternatives in your hand, because it may not, as you start listening, you may not go to where you think you were going first. And then you need to make a change, right? You need to change your strategy. And you need to be open for that, because I see some negotiators, they are no, that's what I want. And they are not opening for other strategies. So as a negotiator, you need to be always ready to think different. So as the course of the negotiation goes is, okay, this is not working. What can I do different here?
I really like that, Isabella. You have coined something. I'm going to plagiarize, if you don't mind. Zone of agreement. I like that a lot, because when we were talking about you setting your objectives prior to the meeting, and you have your pyramid of objectives, your no-goes and your pretty important things, and it'd be nice to have kind of hierarchy. You'd be surprised how when you're in the negotiation, how your no-goes, they narrow. What's really critical about that no-go becomes clearer as you discuss it with your counterparty. So you end up, you don't want to be too rigid with your objectives. A zone of objectives, it sounds like the right.
Exactly. And that's what we hear a lot on negotiation trainings and courses. They use two acronyms. They use ZOPA and they use BACNA. So ZOPA is really what I was talking about, is the zone of possible agreement. So what is the range that I can accept that will be a common ground for me and my party? So if you are negotiating a price as an example, so what you need to think is, for me, right, as the buyer, I have the maximum price that I'm willing to pay. And the seller, they have the minimum price they want to sell. So my ZOPA, before I go and I start negotiations, I need to think about that. What is the minimum and the maximum that I can accept? But also look for your BACNA. BACNA is the best alternative to a negotiated agreement. Is okay, if my ZOPA does not work, what are my other alternatives? What can I look for? If we don't agree on price, as an example, I wanted 10, the other person wanted 20, we don't come up on agreement, but what are the other options? Can I negotiate payment terms? Can I negotiate down payment? Can I negotiate other aspects? Can I negotiate a rebate? So as negotiators, you always need to have other alternatives in mind that you may have to use, because you may not achieve your ZOPA. You may not, agree on a common ground, but there will be other options that you need to have in mind.
Perfect. Thank you. We have audience questions just flooding in. So good points. So our next audience questions, and it's kind of what we're a little bit talking about with, give and take, is how do you manage customers or vendors that you negotiate with frequently? For example, situations where giving up one-time concession might get a deal done, but then that concessions becomes expected in future negotiations.
Well, given that we've just been through a historic downturn, that is a very common question, because for the last 8 years, we have accepted some things that we otherwise might not have to get a job. Sometimes you have to weigh these things against the business need, the overall big picture. If this is not a risk allocation or a financial allocation that you want to perpetuate through the upturn, you're just going to have to say so. It is not, a welcome thing for me. I'm talking with customers, and customers will say things to me like, well, why don't we use that contract from 4 years ago? And I say, okay, but we're going to have to change this. So before you go in, it's good to be prepared and say, what if they say that to me? What if they say they want to use some term from 4 years ago when we were at the depths of our industry? You have to be ready to say either no or okay, but in order to get yourself to a good position. Precedents cannot be allowed to stand if they are a high-risk position that you took in exchange for another business need that is no longer present. It's okay.
And I think when you take pauses in your negotiation, that's how you prepare and you plan for those type of arguments you are going to use. So you are not going to use everything at the first meeting. So you need to be smart of how you split your steps and your phases. So it will also depend on what the other party is going to tell you. So if you go to your first meeting, again, you are going to listen, and then in your mind, you prepare a strategy. and you will be changing and using your botnas as you go. You are not giving or saying everything at the first time. So depending on how you progress, will be many meetings, many calls, then you start using more and more the alternatives you have in your hands, right? You are not going to use or drop them all at one time. Be smart and use your pauses.
Perfect. Thank you. So when you were talking about the downturn and kind of how we've transitioned over the last, I mean, even decade, how have you seen negotiations change over the course of your career? Like, have they changed that much? Have you seen different trends?
Well, if I can jump in there, having had a 40+ year career, I have a lot of changes. But when you talk about my business, which is drilling and rigs, the difference is back when I first started, the discussions were all about relationship. They were, hey, let's go to a football game together. Hey, come to lunch with me. You know, hey, I'm going to send you a basket of fruit. It was so much about that sometimes we got tools out there that didn't work very well. It has really changed now. Sales are much more technical. And more often we have people with technical backgrounds in a sales role. And that's because companies are now, they're very aware of their own performance. We have changed to a data-driven, performance-driven culture in the oil and gas industry. And in order to achieve those performance metrics, there has to be technical analysis of our performance and response to it, making plans for what we would change. So this is kind of like the question before about innovation and how do you get your one unique product out in front of people. Well, that is our job, is to get our customers to be aware of why we're different, why we think we're better, what do we have to show. So the difference between relationship sales and technical sales with the relationship as well has been, to me, a big shift.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think if we look to the past, back when I was in Brazil dealing with more Petrobras, it was more like a person type of negotiation. Like you were going for lunches, you were going for a happy hour, and that's where negotiations were happening. It was like based on real-time experience, based on both sides' knowledge, like where they were at the table. I think now it's a more data-driven for both sides. You do not sit to negotiate if you don't have all the historical data. And that's, I think, for both buyer and seller. Sometimes it happens when we sit down with some sellers and they are not prepared. They still don't have the data. That's when it's a big advantage for me as procurement, as a buyer, because I did my homework, right? We are doing negotiations based on data. And I think that's the big change right now, is the data-driven negotiations. Yes, we still have relationships. We still meet our vendors or our customers. But when it's time to sit down, negotiate, and talk about what do we want as an outcome, you need to have that data-driven behind us.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. We have another audience question, and it's kind of going on the new technology side, Stacy, and innovation is, do you have any tips or suggestions on how to penetrate or be the first one in the deep water offshore market where every customer may want someone else to try a new tech first, or because risk is a big driver?
Wow, that's a multi-layered question, multi-layered answer. But, you know, one way to do that is conferences. So present a paper at a conference. Make sure that you have your patents applied for before you go and speak at the conference. But speaking at conferences is a great way to drum up interest in your new products and open some doors. Another way is to use existing relationships to bring along your person with the new product or the new innovation and have them speak to folks that we're already speaking to about similar product lines. Third thing is just kind of what you might call a shotgun blast, which is use everything. Put something on, if you have a professional LinkedIn site, or if you are on Facebook, or if you have any other social media where you can present your product that's appropriate for your business, do it. If you can, if you feel like putting an ad in the IADC drilling engineering, or drilling publication, do that. They need the revenue, so put an ad in. Then the other ways are simply cold calling, but cold calling is the last on my list. There's so many other ways to reach potential customers before you get to that step.
Awesome. Thank you. And what a great way social media has changed a little bit on how negotiations are worked as well, right? That wasn't a thing. It's becoming very, very prominent this day and age. So moving on, what do you think are the long-term consequences if we don't negotiate? And this can be on a developmental side as well, not just a sales role.
So I think when we think about more career development, right? If you don't negotiate, right? As we mentioned in the beginning, like knowing how and when you will, knowing how and when to do, you will stay where you are. So you have to negotiate. I do believe in companies that have career progression plans. So that's very important for your career growth, but we need to be the advocates for ourselves. So we need to speak up. We need to negotiate. So I think that can be long-term consequences if you don't do that. So speak up, negotiate for yourself.
Yeah, stagnation is the consequence. But that's a good point. How do you prevent that? So let's just say that you are in a job and you want to grow and develop. Well, one of the first things that you can do is look around you and see what kind of job would you like to have next. And be prepared, because you never know when somebody's going to ask you that exact question. What do you want to do next? And I cannot tell you how many times in my career that has propelled me to go get that very job that I dreamed of. So have in mind, look around you, see where you want to go next, what kinds of experiences you want, whether it's the next job or even new experiences within your current job. Have it in mind, have it ready. So that's one way. And the second, of course, yes, is to go and advocate for yourself. Go to your boss, go to your coworkers, say, hey, I'm interested in this. Wonder how I can get myself. Yeah, that's how you do it. You've got to advocate for yourself, and you can use the same principles we were just discussing as negotiating in business to be ready, do your homework, have your objectives ready. Somebody someday is going to say, oh, I heard the so-and-so job is potentially going to be open. Great. That means you're going to be the first one to go and put your name in the hat. And then the other, of course, is building relationships. It's just the way human nature works. Make sure you're talking to people. Make sure that you're seeking to work with them on a project or something that might help you build their knowledge of you and what your skills are and what your go get 'em kind of attitude. That will really help you in the long run.
Well, thank you. I've always been told it's not your employer's job to tell you where your career is going. It's up to you to go get it.
That's good advice, Leah.
With both me and Stacy, we were sharing some thoughts yesterday, and we we talk about that. So that's how kind of how happened with us. We were ready, and then the opportunity came. We just saying, "Hey, I'm here. You know, that's me. I'm ready for this position. I have this, I have that. I check all the boxes." So I think that's how it happened with us.
Yes, and so I'm going to stop here and tell a little story because it's related. There is a young woman who I met at college, and then that young woman met me at a Women in Energy event, and came over and said hi and made sure I knew she was there. And then that young woman called me and said, "Hey, can we have lunch? I'm just asking for career advice." And we did that. And the next thing I know, an opportunity came up and I needed someone to work for me. And I hired her. And that person is Liana Carnes. So she was a self-advocate, and that works, people. It works.
Yeah, absolutely. Who knew? One instance in college, and now I'm here 4 years later.
Yeah. So that kind of thing, it's both knowledge and relationships, but relationships will definitely help you. Don't be shy. Get out there and talk to people.
Absolutely. So when we're talking about negotiations, we talked about starting a negotiation, we talked about what you should do during it, but when should you stop negotiating? And have you ever failed to reach an agreement? Like how do you go about that?
I've got a couple of thoughts about that. Any negotiation, anything you might consider like that is what we call win, lose, or draw. You know how you win, you sign a contract. You know how you lose, you don't. But how do you draw? Drawing is possible in a negotiation. And an example that I have is one in which a customer had proposed a financial arrangement for some work that we worked on for a long period of time to see how it might work. And ultimately, we were not able to come to agreement on that financial arrangement. However, a few years later, as a result of the experience and having time to learn about us and our performance and our depth of technical engineering and a valuable job under different financial conditions. And it was really one where you could consider it a draw. So there's different ways of coming to a negotiation and what you might get out of it. You may think that it's a loss because right now, this minute, you did not get the objective that you had set. But you may have really impressed your counterparty with your dedication, your commitment, and the situation that you're in now may be different for them in the future. And they come back to you and say, "You know what, you really impressed us with what you can do. We want to find a way to work with you."
Yeah, I do agree. I think that walking away from a deal should always be an option, right? I believe you should never accept a bad deal just to accept, right? So if you don't achieve an agreement, walking away is still an option. I don't see that this being bad or a failure. It's better not to accept than doing a bad deal. And then again, you can come back later and you change your strategy, but you should stop when you think you are going to a bad deal.
Oh, perfect. What are some, no-goes or some potholes you need to avoid when you're in a negotiation?
So for me, and that's a challenge as well, I think don't over negotiate. For me, something that we need to always keep in mind as procurement, right? So Stacy may have a different point of view as being on the other side as the seller. But I think don't over negotiate is very important. So sometimes in a negotiation, you have the power. So you want to use everything you can, but at what price, right? You need to think about that you are building a relationship, that you are going to continue talking with that vendor, that it's something that you are not going to get everything you want and over negotiate something that maybe in the future the vendor doesn't want to even talk with you. So be mindful when you are on the procurement side to don't over negotiate.
Yeah, absolutely. I apologize. My internet has fallen off here, but I am here.
Yeah, you are back.
Thank you, Stacy. We do have an audience question. As a buyer, how is cost control considered during negotiations on prices that will affect multiple drilling rigs or a company as a whole?
I think the basics, like I said, is to know what's your limit, right? So, if you're thinking about cost control, what's the minimum you are going to accept. So for anything you are negotiating, that's what you have to define, and you have to strategize as what is the minimum I'm going to accept. What's the minimum and what's the maximum, right? And that's where the bargaining phase of negotiation will happen, where you need to find that common ground with your seller.
Absolutely. Stacey, do you have anything to add to that?
No.
Okay. So how does your ego play a role in negotiation? Does the need to please ever play a role, or do you play around with that a little bit while you're in the room? Or
So I look at that actually in two parts. One is about the ego. Man, you got to get that in check before you walk in the door. And that, I think, partly you do get in check by doing the planning, by sitting down and thinking about logically what it is that you want to achieve. Not only that, but you have to recognize that you don't have to do this alone. Professionally, I always have a team, and you can draw upon other people's ideas. If you're coming up with the planning, it's good to do it with other people, especially if others are going to be in the room during the negotiation with you. You develop a plan not only for what you want to achieve, but also who's going to do the talking and who's going to take the lead role on this topic versus that topic. Planning helps you check your ego. The other part of the question, though, is it's a little different perspective. When you go into a negotiation, you want to ensure that the people who are in the negotiation with you understand the objectives. And so I can say this because I'm an engineer, but the worst thing I can do is bring an engineer with me to a negotiation. Because as engineers, we are taught to solve problems. So any problem the customer comes up with, we want to jump right up and say, I can do that. I can solve that. And sometimes it's not really our job to solve. It's my customer's job to solve. Yes, we can work together on it, but you have to be aware of what is the service that you're providing? And are you overstepping what your core service description is? And be careful about going into that. So sometimes people will jump up and just, as you say, eager to please. It's a wonderful characteristic, but you can easily overcommit yourself if you aren't firmly in possession of your objectives.
Great.
Yeah, I agree. I think, Liana, ego plays a big role in the wrong direction in a negotiation. I remember reading an article some months ago that said that ego is one of the 7 sins of negotiation. So we need to keep that in mind. And again, both sides, buyer or seller, We need to make sure we don't take excessive emotions, and we'll talk a little bit more about emotions, where it can drive you to a lose-lose outcome.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I feel like sometimes I can be like really hot about something, right? You're just like so fired up and you're like, wait a minute, let's take a step back, breathe, let's think about it a little
Emotions
bit.
are good, right? So in everything we do, emotions are good, but you need to have the skills of emotional intelligence to know how to use that. And it's not different in a negotiation. You need to use your emotions, right, to attract the person you are negotiating with, but make sure you have that under control, because you can be too nervous depending on how the person is reacting to what you are arguing, to what you are asking. And then it's where you will lose it if you get too emotional. So you need to be smart on how you use that.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you. So kind of take a couple steps back. So when we talked about starting a negotiation, we talked about the process and how to end it. How does one learn how to negotiate? Is that something natural? What are some things that we can do to practice the art of negotiating?
Yeah, I think that, oh, sorry, Stacey, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I have a couple of different thoughts on that. I mean, anybody can take a class. There are some really good classes out there. Maybe you can convince your company to hire of one of these providers who come in and do 2 or 3 day negotiating training. Pick the one that has videotaping of your sessions in negotiating so that you can learn about your own, weaknesses or unusual body language or something like that. You can really get that in check, but you can also see how are you actually conveying your ideas and see it more like a third person looking at yourself, and it's really helpful. But other than classes, the main way that you learn is go to them and watch people who have been doing this for a long time, find ways to join them in their negotiations so that you can see what kinds of things that they emphasized, what things that they picked out as critical points, how they moved away from difficult situations or how they solved those difficult situations. That's the best thing you can do, is to watch and learn.
Yeah,
Oh, thank you.
and I do agree, Liana, that some people may be born negotiators. They are just so good on that. I joke at my house that I think my daughter is one of those. She's great on negotiating. She will use the right questions. She will get the data. She will use some arguments that I used in the past. So I really believe she was born with that skills, but many of us, we are not, right? So you need to develop those skills. And as Stacey was saying, look for training, look for articles, for books where you can develop communication skills, which I think is the most important one. Like I mentioned, emotional intelligence, planning, value creation, strategy. I think these are the most important skills that you will need to be a good negotiator, but also practice. Just like everything you do, if you are in sports, if you are getting ready for tests or anything in your life, you need to practice. So the more you negotiate, the more prepared you'll be in the future. So if you are in your early phases of career, like Stacey was saying, be part of some negotiations. Start listening and watching the people at your company that negotiate for many years. So as you practice, you will learn those skills as well.
Perfect. Thank you. Oh, we got you on camera, Stacey. Perfect.
All right.
No, it's okay. Stacey, did you have anything else to add to that, or?
I think we'll have to go on to the next question since I was reconnecting.
Oh, okay, that's fine. How do you present the value that you bring to the table when negotiating a deal? Of course, you don't want to lay all your cards out on the table. How do you go about presenting the value?
So there are two different ways of looking at that. Is what is your own strength that you bring to the negotiation? So as you might imagine, when I walk into the room and sit down and we start the negotiations, no one assumes that I'm a 40-year drilling engineer. Most of the time they assume I'm a lawyer. So I guess that's easier for people to assume. But that's their issue, what they assume that I am. What happens during the negotiation is, as I begin to talk to them about which segregation method is used with this dynamic positioning system, they begin to realize that perhaps I have a little bit more knowledge than otherwise they had thought. And you can do this, you can establish this throughout the negotiations, or you can do it up front by saying, hey, this is who I am. So sometimes when we start negotiations, you may wish to call for an introduction of the people who are in the room and jot down what they say so that you know what your counterparty's backgrounds are. That's important because you may be able to reach out to them during a certain issue being discussed and base it on their experience. And that can always help you. So how do you establish personal value? That's some of the ways. How do you present the company's value? I think we just talked about that. It's the same thing that you're doing when you're trying to introduce an innovation or a unique product that your company may have, is you find the ways to bring up those values through other means before you ever get to the negotiating table. If not, you bring a few slides and say, hey, can I show you a couple of things that we're doing here? It won't take but 10 minutes, and try to get those things in early in the discussion.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah, I agree. I think that you will present the value you bring, showing the other party that you know what you're talking about. Again, that you did your research, you did your homework. And sometimes you may not know everything related to what you are negotiating. And that happens a lot with us here. As procurement department in oil and gas, we negotiate all different type of things. Some of things I know, some of the things I don't know much. If we are going technical about equipment and parts, so I think that's fine for you as procurement to bring the specialist with you, the person that will know to answer questions that you may not know. Try to learn as much as possible prior to the meeting, but bring the specialist with you. So one thing that we are doing here a lot, and I know Stacy mentioned about that as well, we are negotiating as a team. So you have the negotiator, the person that will conduct and do more the bargaining side of negotiation, but we also have the specialist, and we also have the person that will get all the notes, will make sure that all the details are going to be captured. Because sometimes what I feel is the person that is negotiating, you don't get all the details because you have, you are there, thinking about your strategy. So it's important to have more people involved in the negotiation. So negotiate as a team. I think you bring a lot of value to what you're going to achieve.
That's true.
Right.
Because if you're talking, you can't be listening. So it's great to have somebody there who's watching the room and seeing what kind of reaction the counterparties are having to what you have to say, and making notes, because really, you're not going to catch all of it. You're going to catch quite a bit, but yeah, absolutely important.
Oh, great. We do have an audience question here. Would you share your thoughts on a difference in negotiation with a vendor that you would like to establish a long-term relationship with versus a negotiation for a one-time purchase?
Well, as a person who works with customers, they're all important. You never know when that one-off customer may come up with a development program that lasts for 3 years, and you've made a good impression and you're called back to the table, so it's good. But there are definitely certain principles that you're going to employ differently for a long-term commitment versus a one-off commitment. You can always justify the special conditions of the one-off commitment that you can mitigate in a short period of time versus ones that you couldn't for a long period of time. So those things are fine.
And you need to adapt your strategy having that in mind. So if you are looking for a long relationship with that vendor, again, you need to negotiate long-term agreements, right? You need to negotiate looking for your yearly forecast or 2 years forecast. But if you are negotiating a one-time purchase that you are going to buy that specific equipment as an example, and you are not going to buy anymore, then you go, in my opinion, you go all in, because you need to get that discount or you need to get the advantage that you are looking for. So I think you need to adapt your strategy if, yes, you are looking for a long-term relationship or will be a one-time purchase that you know you are not going to be buying anymore. So be open to adapt your strategy.
Oh, perfect. Thank you. Okay. So, talking about, value and and skills. So what are the skills that you think are required to influence the way other people think?
I really think it's when you talk about influencing is effective communication, right? I think it's critical to have that to influence the way the other people think. It's essential to have like clear communication. You clear mention what you are hoping to walk away with and where your boundaries are. Make the right question, knowing how to articulate. So I would really say that the skills that you need to influence the other is the communication. Don't be afraid to ask for what you want. That's what Stacy said in the beginning of a conversation. So that's something, if you don't have, you have to develop in yourself if you want to be successful in negotiations.
Absolutely. And knowing how to build that relationship, whether you built it because you invited them over for a product demonstration, or you went to a baseball game together, or you just walked in and you've never met them before. You've got to find those ways to make a personal connection. It's just, we're not talking about undue influence. We're just talking about people, and people like to interact with other people on personal issues and just be friendly. Generally speaking, there are every now and then you come up against somebody who doesn't feel that way, but most of the time that's the case. And so those are important skills. And I think that the other skill is one that you probably need to develop as a young person, and it usually takes time to do, and that is the business view. So I tell the story about when I was a young engineer, and for a while I was a reservoir engineer, and they gave me my own field, and I could optimize the production of this field. And I was so excited, and I'm good at it. And I went to optimize the production and tripled the production of gas for my field. Would they spend the money to go do this? And the answer was no. I thought, why would you not want to triple the production of your field? Well, gas was going for 57 cents an MCF. And what was the value in producing gas at a terrible rate like that? That was a business decision. Over time, you need to understand your own market and build a skill in yourself of understanding why business drivers aren't always the same as the drivers of this particular deal, and that they need to be married up. They need to be matched up. And some of those are set via goals of the corporation, goals of the executives, goals of the directors, goals of the engineers and analysts. You know, it goes at all these different levels, but you need to understand that there is a business view of what you're negotiating, and that needs to be understood.
Right. All right, we're going to start slowing it down here. This is the second to the last question is, what would be your approach if you and a teammate or colleague disagree on how to move forward in a negotiation process? You're in that room and you have one opinion, your colleague and your peer have another opinion. How do we resolve those disagreements, or how do you move on from that?
Well, first, I would say I cannot emphasize enough how important it is that you and your team look together, that you are appearing to your counterpart as one unified group. So if you have a disagreement, and that does happen, and you recognize it, then the leader of the team needs to call a timeout and just leave the room and step outside and talk about it. So don't argue with your colleagues in front of your counterparty. Do not do that. Just call a quick timeout, which is perfectly normal in a negotiation. Find a room where your counterparty. For me, I'm always at the customer's office, so I'm going to want to find a room where other employees of that company aren't going to be hearing us. If you go to a private place and you work it out. Usually this is driven by the roles that you set before you get into the negotiation. Who is the owner of the outcome of this negotiation? Who is the one who needs to call it if there is a disagreement? Anyone can call it and say, could you just step outside for a minute? So no matter what role you're in, if you really feel strongly about it, step out.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think if it's a teammate or if it's a seller-buyer situation, the best way, in my opinion, to resolve a deadlock is take a break. Just take a break, right? If you see it's not going where you want to go, it's going to the wrong direction, it's totally fine to take a break, step away from the table, think about it, reframe our strategy, think about other ways that you can find the agreement.
Yeah, sometimes I see my counterparties having that thought, and they're talking about it in front of us, and I realize that's not in their best interest, and out of respect for them, I may offer them a timeout, even though they're the ones in control of the meeting, just so that they can resolve their issues before we do.
Great. All right. So as we're wrapping up here, so the last question. If there was one thing you hope the people in the audience today do because of this conversation, what would it be?
Well, I think for me, the most thing we talked here, and I want you guys, young professionals, to lead with is the planning piece. Who knows me knows I'm a planner person. I plan everything in advance. I plan all my vacations with 1 year in advance. So in negotiation, it's not different. You have to plan. You have to do your homework. You need to be ready to sit down and negotiate. Don't just sit down without having all that preparation ready. You will be more confident if you do that, and this will help you on your arguments, will help you with your outcome.
Absolutely. That was what I wrote down too, is do your homework. And that matters whether it is your professional role as a negotiator or whether it is a personal issue or a career development issue. Plan ahead for things that you really want. That's the only way to be successful. And as part of your plan, what is that? Well, know what your objectives are, know who your counterparties are and what's important to them, and know your business. Say that you wanted to ask for a move to a new role. You need to understand what the interests are of the person you're asking this of. If it's your boss may be thinking, this person has only been in this role for 9 months. That's a little creepy to be asking me now for another role. Or they may be thinking, gosh, this person is outstanding, and I'm going to be left with a hole in my organization if I help to develop them. Then you need to start helping them understand what value they might get out of that development. Maybe it's because they can be seen as a person who develops people and therefore attracts more talented people to the goal. There's all kinds of ways that you can develop your skills, but all of it is about being ready, building relationships, knowing the plan.
Well, that's awesome. Thank you both so much for being here today. And what an honor it is to have me moderate. These webinars have gotten some big hits and really great advice for our young professionals and people that maybe have been in their career for a little while and are looking for a change. But I really appreciate both of you for coming in and coming on and sharing your insights. I'm going to pass it over to Bill for some closing remarks. We do have an exit poll going on, so if you could please do that before we end, that would be fantastic. I think this is the last webinar of the year, so I will be logging off after this, but thank you again so much, and thank you for the community. Angie, you've done a fantastic job with helping us put these on, and I'll kick it off to you, Bill. Thank you.
Thanks, Leon. Appreciate it. And thank you to everyone for joining us today. And of course, a very special thank you to Isabella and Stacy for offering their time and knowledge to all of us. When I get the opportunity to come to events like this, it always makes me ruminate on a piece of advice a mentor gave me years and years ago, which is, you never know all the things you don't know until you do know them. And I walk away today feeling exactly that. So exposure like today is incredibly special for our members. And navigating their early stages of their career, we really can't underscore what your insights do for us. So thank you so much for being here today. And thank you for showing your support to young professionals in the drilling industry. To all of our attendees, this is our last webinar for 2023. However, we are presently working on the 2024 calendar, so we encourage you to keep an eye on our LinkedIn page for those upcoming dates. For the remainder of 2023, we are offering 3 in-person events that we hope to see you all at. Next Friday, September the 22nd, we've rented out 2 conjoining party suites at Constellation Field in Sugar Land, Texas, where we'll be watching the Astros minor league affiliate, the Sugar Land Space Cowboys, take on the El Paso Chihuahuas. Registration is currently open on the IADC website, and drinks and beverages will be provided to our attendees. Thursday, October 19th, we'll also be hosting our final luncheon with leaders for the year at the Houston Petroleum Club. The speakers list is nearly finalized, and we'll be opening registration to that shortly. So again, keep an eye out on your emails and your LinkedIn pages. Finally, in November 9th, we hope to see everyone join us at the AGM in Austin, Texas this year. November 9th, the IADC Young Professionals Committee will be hosting a happy hour dinner. So again, keep an eye open for registration for that. As with all of our events, attendance is free to our membership. And once again, we'd like to thank our speakers, our IADC members, our distinguished panelists, and of course, our broad spectrum of sponsors who contribute each year to make sure that events like this can continue to happen for the benefit of young professionals in the industry. We look forward to seeing everyone at the remainder of the events for the year, and as well as our programming for 2024. So with that, I adjourn the webinar and ask everyone to keep those rigs turned to the right. Take care.